Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's a lovely Sabbath morning. It's been an exciting past 24 hours because I have experienced the thrill.
Can't hear you.
I have experienced the thrill of being a great-grandfather for the 8th and 9th time because I had 2 great-granddaughters born in the last 24 hours. One, thank you. I'll pass that along to the mothers. One of them in Fletcher, North Carolina, where my grandson is a history teacher there at the academy, and his dear wife, Kim, gave birth to a little baby girl. And then in Dalton, Georgia, where my other granddaughter gave birth to a little baby girl after some hours of labor and finally a C-section. So it's been a little traumatic the last 24 hours, especially the last hour, just finding out that Kaylee, they had to do a C-section. But that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about new birth. We're talking about the First Amendment. We're talking about the Constitution. And so it's right in harmony with life, the expanding of life, new life. And we are fortunate, are we not, to be a part of a new experiment, 200 years of democracy in the history of mankind. We are a fortunate people. Now, in introducing our speaker of the morning, Brother Forrest Howe, I asked him to provide for me a little background information on him. So he sent me 3 pages, which I've tried to condense into 1. No, he sent me a lovely email, which I really had to work at to get from him. He's hard to be serious, let me put it that way. And so he finally got very serious, and I'm going to read this, but I just want to make a comment that on his paternal grandmother side, she was a direct Mayflower descendant to the Mayflower. So she was one of the first illegal immigrants to arrive here on these shores.
You were boat people.
Pardon me?
You were boat people.
Oh, they were boat people. Anyway. You know, we all come from illegal immigrants in a sense, don't we? Especially in the initial founding of our country. But here's what Forrest wrote. Forrest Howe has had an interest in American history since a youngster. His paternal grandmother, a direct Mayflower descendant, and his paternal grandfather, a descendant of early settlers, in 1637 in Watertown, Massachusetts Bay Colony, would regale him with stories of the family. His grandmother would tell of one ancestor who served in on Washington's staff, who was good with a sword, a pistol, and a rifle, and with the ladies. She would also follow with a twinkle in her eye and say, the reason he was good with the former was because of the latter. You have to meditate on that a bit. The Howe family, led by Forrest's great-grandfather, John Howe, left Rockingham County, New Hampshire, and headed west on the New Erie Canal, setting first in Rochester County, New York, and from there they immigrated to then Upper Canada, Ontario, and from there to Central Michigan, where they were some of the earliest settlers in Ingham County. There they cut farms out of the woods, built homes, and raised children. Forrest is one of the first in his lineage, 5 generations, to leave Ingham County, so early American history was in his bloodline very early. On his mother's side of the family, Scots-Irish Presbyterians came to America in the middle of the 18th century and settled on the eastern shore of Maryland. Let me make a comment about the Scots-Irish. May I?
Oh, please.
Jim Webb, who was the former Secretary of the Navy, wrote a book entitled Born Fighting, and he traces the history of his family. And he discovered in so doing that where the Scots-Irish settled in the southeastern part of the United States, there are more congressional medal of winters in that section of the country than anywhere else in the United States. The Scots-Irish were brought to the United States to be a buffer between the Episcopalians, the English, and the Native Americans. They basically have a warrior, that's where Forrest gets his, yes. So when Forrest and his family, no, let me go back, sorry. After the Revolutionary War, Solomon Sullivan, a participant in that engagement, a member of the 1st Maryland Regiment, converted to Quakerism, or a form thereof, and along with several other families, migrated to the Piedmont region of North Carolina. So when Forrest and his family went to work for the Southern New England Conference, he was right at home. Everywhere he turned, there was some history. Weekly, he would drive by Walden Pond, Old North Bridge, and Lexington Green. The town of Lancaster, the home of the former Atlantic Union College, had a town saying, quote, when Lancaster celebrated its centennial, America still had a king. Lancaster had an old cemetery way back in the woods called the Indian Cemetery, not because Indians were buried there, but rather settlers who were massacred during the King Philip's Way, or in 1676. As part of his portfolio, Howe had the title of Secretary for Religious Liberty. As a result, his interests spurred even more into the issue leading up to the development of the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Thus, development of the First Amendment became a great interest. He has been reading materials on the Constitutions, its myths and challenges. How did America separate church from state? Why did they do this? Was it just a secular Enlightenment concept, or did it have religious roots as well? So Howe was led to Nicol P. Miller's book, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, Dissenting Protestants and the Separation of Church and State. And so, Brother Forrest, with prayer, we welcome you to this class. Loving Father, we truly are a blessed people to be a part of this great nation. Problems, yes, but opportunities many. Accomplishments, wonderful, and disappointments, many. Yet, a great light to the world, a harbor for the church, a place for religious freedom to take root and to spread throughout the world. Pray for Brother Forrest as he makes his presentation. May we have open hearts, receptive minds. May we be challenged and come forth better citizens and better Christians, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
We'll get this fixed. Appreciate that introduction. I was listening to it. I said, man, I can't wait for this guy. And then I realized it was me. So, anyway. By the way, next week, Gary Chartier will be speaking to us. And then, can you get that?
Listen. Oh, my word. Okay.
I'll tell you.
Thank you. Okay, Gary Chartier will be speaking to us next week, and then not yet, Laura, it's Ron Osborne is going to be speaking to us, and then Dr. Keto, and then for the month of September, it will be Dr. Zercher speaking about his book, is it Idolatry of Blood? Is that the title? Okay. And so we promising a very eventful period for the next 2 months, 3 months. So anyway, okay. Oh, and by the way, our executive vice president in charge of mailing list, where are you, executive vice president? There he is back there. Put your name on here if you'd like to be on our mailing list. So do that. Okay. Every group has its stories. They're myths, they're legends. And the United States is no different. Recently I've been actually listening to one of the greatest myths of Roman history in the Aeneid, about the movement of the Trojans to what is now Italy. It's a very fascinating story. It's kind of along the same line as the Iliad and the Odyssey. All groups, Hebrews have their stories. American Indians have their stories. We as Americans have our stories. And some of them are not always accurate, but they're good stories to tell anyway. For instance, George Washington did not cut down that cherry tree. So you can lay that one aside. But other myths develop, and one of those myths is around the Constitution of the United States. There are even those in the United States today that almost feel like it was the third tablet that Moses had when he came down from the mountain. It was almost delivered to those men, and they were all men, there in Philadelphia in 1787, in the summer of 1787. The truth of the matter is, they spent that whole summer developing this document, and when they left, some of them didn't sign it. Others that did sign it said, I'm not really sure what this document says. And so this idea that we need to go back to the original concept or the understanding of the American Constitution is kind of a myth in itself. Frankly, in couple, three of the colonies, it almost didn't make it. It's a close run thing. Virginia, it got through okay because James Madison promised that there would be a Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights were added on in 1791 in the first Congress. By the way, we talk about the 10 amendments. There actually were 12, but 2 of them weren't voted. And so, and that's not a joke, Dr. So sometimes somebody's saying, so anyway. So there were 12 that were submitted and 10 were voted. And this issue of what does it say? What does it mean? Well, it depends whether you were a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist. Washington and Adams were Federalists. Madison and Jefferson were Anti-Federalists. Although Madison, at the initial part of the Constitution ratification, was in favor of it. Later on, he realized there had to be some things changed. And so he and Alexander Hamilton parted their ways over these issues. So, what was the original intent of the American Constitution? Depends. That's a good legal term, isn't it, Donna? You always say, it depends.
You do, but you can't dismiss originalism quite
Oh, no, I'm not.
clearly or as easily as you've done.
She's writing, I see that there, okay. All I'm trying to say is that the original intent, it depends on who you're talking to in many ways. Anti-Federalist, Federalist. I have a book here. This is not what they meant. And this is Michael Austin. He has written this book in regards to some of the issues that are going on today, especially in regards to the freedom of religion, as well as the Second Amendment. So it's very interesting what some have made statements, and frankly, that's not what Matter of fact, there are some things that weren't even originally said. I have another book here which has a similar cover to, this is the book that we're going to be looking at today. Nicholas Miller, who's at Andrews University. I guess I should say, I won't say something, yeah, I will. But this is Greg Frazier, who's written a book on the religious beliefs of the American founders. And he teaches, he's a professor at a school over by the Grapevine. It's a conservative religious school, but he's come up with the view that the founding generation were not as religious as we think they were. So it's a very good book, and I would highly recommend it. It's an easy read. There's another book I haven't had a chance to read yet. It's called The Partisan Republic, and it's about what happened between 1800 and about 1850. Anyway. This book, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment by Nicholas Miller. Now, Dr. Miller is a graduate of Pacific Union College. He is also has a JD from Columbia University. That's not a second or third rate law school, is it? No. And he also has a PhD from Notre Dame du Lac. If you don't know where that is, that's called Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They're in South Bend, Indiana. And they were one of our mortal enemies when I was at Michigan State for football. So anyway, they're a good school, but they're just 20 miles from Andrews University. When I was there, that's when streaking was in vogue. Somebody actually streaked across the front of the Pioneer Memorial Church, and they were from Notre Dame, of course. Anyway, and so we're going to take a look at Dr. Miller's premise, which is going to be distinct in some way. But let me read the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it's really kind of a lengthy one, but the one that we're going to look at here is the Establishment Clause, the establishment of religion, and the free exercise. And we want to take a look and see how they develop. By the time of the founding generation in the 1770s, the colonies had changed significantly from the stories that we have heard about the Pilgrims with their pointy hats and, their funny shoes and all that, which they truly were a theocracy. And so by the time we get to the 1770s, there was a movement going on, and part of it is because of the Enlightenment. And many historians feel that the reason that there was a separation of church and state was because of the emphasis of the Enlightenment. And that meant Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, even George Washington. By the way, George Washington was not really that religious. This picture of him kneeling in the woods at Valley Forge? It's another one of Parson Weems' myths. George Washington, when he was president, attended an Anglican church in New York City and would not take communion because they would have their homily and then they would go forward. He would never kneel, and he would never take communion. And so the pastor the next Sunday after Washington was there berated him publicly for not coming forward to take communion. And so Washington said, never will he have to berate me again. He just never showed up again to church. In all of the thousands of pages of writing by George Washington, Jesus Christ is only mentioned once. So, anyway. But what's different about Dr. Nicholas Miller's presentation? What about the Enlightenment? Did it have that much to say? did Washington and Jefferson and Paine and Franklin. Is that not true? And probably that's true to a part. But Dr. Miller's thesis is that there was another movement that caused the separation of church and state. And it wasn't just the Enlightenment with a capital E that caused the early colonists to cause a separation of church and state. 10 of the colonies had a state church. 3 of the colonies did not. So where does this all begin? Well, I want to go back, and this is how he divides the book. He divides it into a chapter dealing with 2 individuals at a time, and he starts out with Martin Luther and John Milton. Luther, we've studied Luther before, and we know that Luther was one of the great leaders of the magisterial Reformation. Luther's main issue early on was that the individual could judge for themselves. Remember, he said the plowboy will be able to understand the Bible better than the priest. And so it was private judgment that was very strong with Martin Luther. Unfortunately, as things developed, Luther kind of changed his view, especially during the Peasants' Revolt. Didn't think it was such a good idea for all these peasants coming up with their own ideas for the Reformation. And then, of course, then there was John Calvin in Geneva. His theology and take was a little different. It wasn't a stellar event when Servetus was executed. For of all things, Servetus was executed. You know why? Because he was not a Trinitarian. I think there were some other issues too, but that was the biggie. And I didn't know that, but in those days, as an act of mercy, they would put a packet of gunpowder next to the heart when the flames were coming up. So, and if you know, black powder is explosive. It's not like modern gunpowder, which is very fast burning, but it's not explosive. And then the powder would explode and kill them instantly. Calvin wouldn't even let him do that for Servetus. So in the early days, you know, it was supposed to be a religious revival. They weren't always that generous to those who disagreed with them. Matter of fact, there's a whole nother Reformation that we as Seventh-day Adventists come out of more than the magisterial Reformation, and that's the Anabaptist Reformation. And that is not just means baptized again. And thousands, literally thousands of Anabaptists were persecuted and killed because they believed in baptism again. We have out of that group the Mennonites, the Quakers. These people died by the thousands. Oh, and by the way, one of the ways that they would execute them, well, you want to be baptized again? Well, let me show you what we're going to do. We're going to baptize you again. You know, maybe hold you under. I remember one time I had a guy who joined a church, and he said, you know, I haven't had a real good life. Just hold me under just a little longer. So anyway, but they really believe. So thousands of these people died for their faith at the hands, not just of Catholics. Now, we always like to blame the Catholics for this kind of stuff, but let me tell you, it was also the Protestant, the Lutheran Church, as well as the Calvinist Church. In 1685, the Edict of Nantes was revoked, and many of the French Huguenots went to the Netherlands. And if you know your pilgrims, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but if you know anything about the pilgrims, they settled at Plymouth Rock, and that wasn't a music group. They had been in Holland for many, many years, 20, 25 years. So they had been influenced directly by the much of this separatist, dissident movement, I should say. And so at this, but the point is, Luther, at the very beginning, felt that independent judgment, private judgment was critical. The state couldn't come and tell you what to believe. Matter of fact, we know that there weren't Bibles in churches. First of all, people couldn't read very well, if that at all. And so the first person in this private judgment was Martin Luther. Attached to him was John Milton, who came about a century later, but John Milton, who, by the way, I actually went to his cottage one time when I was in Great Britain. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely, when you understand why, because King Charles II was looking for him. And you know, when the king is looking for you, it's not a good idea sometimes, especially when you had something to do with the execution of the king's father. Didn't make you real popular. John Milton had, and we know John Milton from Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, some of the imagery that John Milton developed, we see that in some of Ellen White's writings. But again, John Milton, even though he was a poet, wrote a lot on religious history, freedom of the press. But again, his view was it was not the state's responsibility to interpret the scriptures. I'm trying to look at my time here because I'm going to have Dr. Branson say, time's up. Okay, and I'm going to fly here because I want to get into some question and answers. And so this developed. Private judgment came through. William Penn, which we know from Pennsylvania, which, by the way, I learned it was not named after William Penn. It was named after his father. So his name was Penn as well. So, but William Penn was a Quaker. And you know, here's a Quaker who had influence in the king's court.
Only because his father took Jamaica away from the Spanish.
What?
Only because his father took Jamaica away from the Spanish.
Yeah. His father was an admiral in the British, in the Royal Navy. I don't know if they're called the Royal Navy or not, but yeah, it helps to have friends in high places. Was there a song about that? You gotta have friends in high places, Garth Brooks or something like that. You know, my problem is I always have friends in low places, so that doesn't work very well. So Penn was very influential. When he established his colony, there was religious liberty in Pennsylvania. I lived in Pennsylvania for 7 years. Roger, you lived there for more than 8 years, yeah. It's a great state. There's still a lot of Quaker sites. Mennonite through the Amish. Amish and Mennonite are just they're just kind of different degrees. I remember one day going to Reading, which was the conference offices there. Roger's going down Lincoln Highway, and I'm going along Sunday morning. All of a sudden, I saw this van coming behind me, and I knew it was a black bumper Mennonite. Black bumper Mennonites are those who don't like to have shiny bumpers, so they would paint them black. And this car was going over the speed limit, van. And as he went by, I could see, and he had his hand on the steering wheel. He looked like a desk in the van. I think he was preparing his sermon for the next. And my friend once said, "The gospel requireth haste." And so he made it. I hope he made it. And so anyway, Penn. By the way, one person not mentioned by Miller here is Roger Williams, except in passing. And the reason that Williams, according to Miller, was not included was he had established Rhode Island, which, living in New England for years, we would call that Rogue Island. And it still had a reputation of being kind of lawless. That someone said that during the last recession, the mafia had to lay off 3 judges. And so, and there's a building out south and west of Providence, is an old stone building. It's called the Governor's Mansion. Several governors have had to spend some time there after getting out of office. Anyway, but this whole scheme of private judgment, independent judgment, percolated through John Locke, which we could spend an awful lot of time on, who have respected John Locke an awful lot. Especially, or not in religious ways, but in his government, treatises of government. But he wrote a lot on religion as well.
Yeah, Barbara was up on the chair writing.
I will get to that. Thank you, though. Barbara, do you still stand up there? Or? Anyway, and then we go on, and then we come down to the Constitution. Miller is saying it was not just the magisterial Reformation. It wasn't just the Enlightenment, but rather it was this dissident movement from out of the Anabaptist. He actually put James Madison in that group pretty much. So anyway, so now looking at on the board, Miller says there are 3 types of church relations to government. And we're gonna, is that gonna? The first group is by Samuel Puffendorf. Have you ever heard of him? I had never heard of him. But he believed in more of a medieval model of the divine right of kings. At the very top was the theocracy of God. There was the church, and then there was the state. And the individual was responsible to both. And this is what we saw in many of the colonies. The second one is by John Locke, the Dissenting Protestants. And you have theology and God at the top, but you have the individual here. Then you have the church and the state down here.
Why not, can you dim the lights that are reflecting off of the board? So we can see it just a little bit?
Which one?
I don't know.
It's better.
Color.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, and then this one is by Pierre Bayle. This is the skeptical mode, and this is what the 20th century American, many of the 20th century Americans believe is what happened in 1787. Here, there is no God. Here's the individual. Here's the church and the state. Oh, and by the way, in here, the church and the state are separate. And here, the church and the state are separate, but for a different reason. And what Miller is saying is this is the model that was accepted. And if you take a look at what was going on in the colonies in 1787, you will see that there was still a strong belief in God. And the individual was directly responsible to God, but the church and the state are separate, but they're subservient to the individual. Are you getting it? And so, again, this is the model that Miller would say. Now, I think Miller sometimes overstates his position, although I think it's very credible. And the more I look at it, I want to look at it in some more detail. I had accepted this view primarily because of the individual Jefferson and Paine, Franklin. They were not believers at all. And so this is what Miller is saying. It's a new concept to me. I think when he defended his dissertation at Notre Dame, he had to convince his faculty that there was some merit to that. But he does make a good case because of Locke, Penn, Luther. Anyway, this idea that this is carried through and was brought to the colonies much more so than in other countries. Miller postulates that one of the reasons that the French Revolution became very bloody and very or became atheistic, that they didn't have this dissenting view underneath. They had an Enlightenment view, but they didn't have a dissenting view. And so in 1791, when the 10 Amendments were voted, that this was one of the issues. Notice that in the Constitution, the name of God is not mentioned at all. Even in the Declaration of Independence, it's a creator God, which is really more of a deist view. And so again, summing up, Miller's view, there's a whole history going back to Luther here for this discerning Protestant view. I'm sorry, dissenting Protestant view. It was common during the constitutional period. So anyway, that puts me up to my time. I do have I've got 3 more minutes. One of my concerns that as I take a look at what's going on today, Don will probably disagree with me, that sometimes the Constitution, you can't just take the Constitution as it said in 1787, I don't think, in one sense, because they were slaveholders, they were all men, they had to be landowners, and you have to be able to grow. And that's why they allowed amendments. This Constitution also did not apply to the states. And it was not until 1833 that the view of separation of church and state was complete. Well, actually the 14th Amendment, but Massachusetts was the last one in 1833 to do away with the state church. But it's because individuals believed, that these groups believed that the individual had the right to choose and to decide independent judgment. A person is responsible directly to God, not to the state, not to the church. And so that's a big difference. And I said, but my concern is, especially now in the evangelical church, there seems to be, let's get back to this, where America was a Christian nation. Well, what's interesting is the biggest group that were opposed to a combination of church and state, or let me say that were pro-separation of church and state, were Baptists. Because they have been persecuted in many of the states. And so I hope that people realize that America, there was a discussion, and this is what we came up with, and we still don't believe in establishing. I don't think we have as big a problem with establishment of religion as the free exercise thereof. So, but anyway, at this time, I'm going to just...
I think the gentleman there has the mics.
I'll ask you one while they get in the mics out. You said there were 3 states that didn't have an established church at the time of independence. I'm guessing Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. What's the third?
New Jersey. Because they were heavily influenced by Penn. Eduardo.
Forrest, I have a question, but let me read a few pieces here.
Who are you reading from?
Pope encyclicals.
Oh, okay.
It says, separation of church and state reduces the church to a shameful servitude. The other one said, Roman pontiffs have never ceased the circumstances required to refute and condemn the doctrine of separation of church and state. In June 2000...
What year was that written?
Huh?
What year was that written? Or that?
1906. I have the whole encyclical.
That's a-
In June 2017, the Trinity Lutheran Church case, Comer, Sotomayor dissent opinion said, separation of church and state is only a slogan, it's not a commitment anymore. And my question to you, do you still believe that this union of church and state, the church teaches that is the image of the beast, that the first beast was the union of church and state, and this year the Supreme Court decided on the cross, I don't remember the title of the case, but it was a cross, a huge cross standing, and they
Yeah, I don't know how to respond exactly. Early on, even Madison believed in certain, what they call public religion. Jefferson believed in public. Jefferson would attend church, but he really wasn't a Christian at all. So I don't know. The church out along the highway somewhere, across on the highway, I don't know. That's not one of my bigger issues. I have some other issues that, that evangelicals are saying it's not constitutional for same-sex marriages and things like that. I still think we have, but that's a battle we're going to have to fight to keep church separate from state. Who else?
At East Union.
Attorney for the defense. That's loud enough, Donna.
All right. I was just going to say a couple of things.
Yeah.
One,
There we go. Looking for the original intent does not mean that we're going to we're going to assume a set of circumstances that are just like the ones at the beginning. However, because things change, and as someone has said about the Supreme Court, they often stumble around in the penumbra looking for rights that
That's
are
the
not,
shadows, by the way.
that are not explicated in the Constitution originally. But there is also, it seems to me, not an original intent to elevate secularism to the point where you cannot have any public expression of specific religions. And I think that's what the court was saying in the case to which you are referring. It's also, however, true that the court and the American government will set limits on free exercise. And the famous case, which has never been overruled, is Reynolds v. United States. And you're all familiar with it, not maybe by the name, but it's the case in which the Supreme Court said polygamy is banned, is not legal. And of course, there are a variety of reasons, but that case is still there, it's still good law, and polygamy is not any more legal now than it was 100 or some odd years ago when Reynolds was decided. And though excuse me. I think we'll have this fight later. So that's what I'm saying, is that there is a sort of balance between generalized religious freedom, but the state can set limits, especially with what they call laws of general applicability. So this is the peyote cases, where they say nobody gets to use peyote. for instance, specific religious circumstances. I don't think the court was right in that decision, but still, we just have to keep in mind that there are limits to free exercise, despite the lack of establishment.
Well, I just mentioned that, I have some of my colleagues who are strong, quote-unquote, Second Amendment people, and they're saying we shouldn't put any limits on it. I say, wait a minute. There's not one of the Bill of Rights is unlimited. There has to be some limiting. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't do certain. The only amendment that I don't think we really deal much with is the third, about quartering people in our homes. That one hasn't come up yet. But, so I do think, Eduardo, there has to be a balance. Did you want to respond back?
Well, I have another comment. What is the chaplain of the Senate?
Barry Black?
Yeah, I talked to him at the ADC. He was signing the book.
Yeah.
And I said, look, the Ten Commandments has church and state together. Because, do not kill is a commandment. It's a moral commandment. But the state come after you if you kill or you steal. What I think the case of the peyote and the polygamy, what I see myself is the Supreme Court doesn't see the fine line between civil and moral. They don't see when the line jumps to the other side, and they treat it wrongly because they don't see that the same issue has two faces, moral and civil, and they come wrong, and eventually we're going to have a church and state together, and we're going to be in big trouble. Seventh-day Adventists, we're going to be in big trouble because the church is going to enforce their teachings.
I think one of the bigger issue we have today than the founding generation is there were very few secularists. I mean among the people. But now we have secularists, we have Buddhists, we have Hindus, we have Muslims, we have all these, and really it was kind of decision among Christian churches, which denomination. So, and by the way, some of these denominations, when they were state churches, were very powerful, especially in Virginia and Massachusetts. So, by the way, there in Lancaster, up there at the village, the big congregational church, the town came in there to do something, or ask the church to get rid of they have those places they put horses in one day, and they had a big debate on who owned that, because Massachusetts never decided when they no longer had a state church who owned those properties. So I don't know what they ever did, but they had their garage sale in there now. Right here.
The idea of separation between church and state, in my view, is a genial idea. It's an idea of genius.
Yes. Yeah, it's a genius idea.
Yes. And we can affirm that looking at all the wars of religions and all the conflicts in the history that existed. Well, you developed this idea how it originated with Protestantism and ended with the founding fathers putting the First Amendment, freedom of conscience, among others. And looking at the beginning, how it started with Martin Luther, that declared the freedom of Christian in Christ, freedom to choose. What created problems, because it created problems, this wonderful idea created problems and ended in the Peasants' Revolt, because Thomas Müntzer tried to apply this to the social problems. And when we are mixing social and religious, it's creating problems. Well, there is a wonderful book that I read recently, Protestants, the Religion That Created the Modern World. It's a very interesting book, and it presented very interesting and in my view, realistic ideas. But I believe that what the founding fathers came with the idea of the First Amendment, it's a mix of rationalism, which is part of the Enlightenment, with some religious ideas. It's a mixture, and it was, in my view, it was a beautiful combination that gave us this great First Amendment.
Okay, you haven't. Oh. And right, I want to emphasize that again. Miller says that even these dissidents used reason a lot more than this group over here would. Okay. You know, we've had that debate here. We've had discussion, which comes. But is it reason? Or is it revelation which dominates, which trumps the other small t? And even these people, Milton and Penn and Madison, believed that reason took precedence over revelation. And so, anyway, there's a hand back. Yeah.
The men that debated and wrote the Constitution of the United States, they were split on their views.
Oh, yeah.
But they shared one thing in common, and that was their determination that there was going to be no government that would tell them what to do that would abridge their freedom. The Constitution of the United States does not grant any right to any citizen whatsoever. The Constitution was written to make sure that the federal government did not abridge their religions. In fact, they cited God as the author of this unalienable right. And they didn't list those rights because they are basically unlimited to a government that can't abridge anything. Now that's been flipped over. The people that wrote the Constitution placed God number one, the individual number two, and anything that the individual or collectively may create, like state government or a federal government, falls under the authority of the individual. We have now progressed to the point where we're kind of flipping this over and God is now on the bottom. That's an unfortunate thing, but it actually changes the way we think about government and about God, and we tend to invent all these reasons why things should exist the way they're existing now, or at least trending the way they're going. And I fear anything that changes our perception of the God of freedom and the government of limitations.
Okay. I guess my response to you on that would be the Constitution does not say God at all. It's we the people. And that was one of the reasons that Patrick Henry...
I'm sorry, I misspoke. That was the Declaration. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's
the creator God
the
there.
thinking of these men.
Yeah.
It should be all in one
Well, you should read Locke, too, as far as his two treatises of government. We do give up certain rights when we join in society. Can I ask a question? I'd like to have some people respond to that. Can I ask a question?
Please ask the question.
Because this was one of the issues that I kept coming up with is, if we believe in private judgment is premier, what does the church do with that?
Good question. I was thinking that.
What is it? I mean, what is not just the church, but what does any group do? I mean, I think that brings a challenge up Could the church leadership? By the way, my name is Joe Johnson. I'm not. My point is, could the church take the role of the government in our individual? Did you want to respond to that one, Ron?
After you finish.
Yeah, but what I'm just saying is that's more of a rhetorical question that I'm asking.
I guess what you made me think about was that the church likes this clause because it wants the freedom, but it doesn't necessarily give freedom to all its members.
Okay. But now let me ask this: on the other side does an organization, whether a church, Masonic Lodge, or whatever, got to have a right to say there are certain guidelines that you can go here, but you can't go any further. If you don't, you can believe that. But we think it'd be best if you go someplace else to do. I don't know. That's my rhetorical response.
Dr. Branson.
Yes. Now I will return to Dr. Branson.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I have one little historical vignette that may be relevant here. You've emphasized human obligation and freedom, whereas the Constitution's talking about church and state. Church referring to organized religious convictions. It happens that historically, I was a witness to something that has never dropped from my memory, and that is the opinions expressed by the one man in the whole world who was elected to lead the United Nations after the end of World War II. The nations were gathering and spent years, in fact, trying to find agreement on what principles of living together should guide all of them, that they could all sign on. And the man who was elected was obviously, you couldn't choose a Roman Catholic from Rome or a Muslim from Saudi Arabia. You had to use a man who was perceived worldwide as a man who was acceptable to anybody. The man who was elected was, in fact, a highly regarded citizen of the new Republic of Lebanon. And it happened that I was sent, or I went to Lebanon, to Beirut, as a new faculty member at the American University of Beirut. And the man from Lebanon who was actually chosen by the nations of the world to lead them as they were sorting out the rules by which they would be governed, church and state. Charles Malik was his name, and I was there when Charles Malik gave a public lecture to all the university faculty, several hundreds of us. I was there as a young bloke, not really understanding what I was hearing, but looking back, it was the man who was at the very focus of the worldwide consensus seeking to guard them in setting rules to live by. Charles Malik did not ever raise the question of Christian versus Muslim, or Druze, or Buddhism. Charles Malik was rising higher above that. He had been the leader of the United Nations for some years during the heat of these debates. And for his lecture, and I was there in that assembly hall, by his lecture, Charles Malik, a man who came from the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church in Lebanon, he chose to lecture on a verse from the Bible. He disregarded church versus mosque or anything else. He said what really matters is a conviction that comes to your heart and mind from whatever religion you choose. And the verse he quoted, I still remember it because the word stuck in my mind, from the book of Proverbs. And he said here are the words of the verse: righteousness exalteth a nation. Lebanon was a new republic trying to sort out how its various religious communities would live peaceably together. And he chose that book from the Bible, and everyone there was deeply respectful. It was what really matters is in the heart of mankind, not in the particular label of religion that he wears. So, that's all.
Thank you very much. At this time, we're going to have our benediction. But before we have our benediction, just like to say, take a look at that middle model. And that's what Dr. Miller is advocating. And I think there's merit to it. I want to think it over a little more. Said I used to be over here, thought that's what developed in the American Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, but it makes a powerful argument for this. And so, anyway, let's have our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you. Next week, Gary Sherkian.